Hello, Professor. I'm sure that everyone joining me knows who you are, but just in case you don't, this is Professor Richard D. Wolff. He is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show Economic Update, which I highly recommend you watch. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, which is now also available as an ebook. It can be found along with his other works, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at democracyatwork.info. So, welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
So there are a few questions that we'd love to get your insight on. My channel and the political perspective of my channel is a little more in-depth and a little more into the theory than you might be used to in these sort of interviews, and I hope that's all right with you. My first question, and one I got requested from my audience, is, what are your opinions on the political and economic nature of China and its particular trajectory, with a focus on the question of imperialism, whether you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense? Could we get your opinion on that, please?
Sure. It has always been the case from the earliest days of socialism, and the same is true of communism, that different people interpreted what these words, what these terms mean. And the debate has been sometimes very strident, very loud, very intense, and at other times less so. By some definitions, then, China is a socialist economic system. Because in these definitions, socialism represents a powerful, perhaps even dominating role of the government in regulating, taxing, shaping, influencing what the economy does on a day-by-day basis. In these definitions of socialism, some would argue it's perfectly okay if the capitalist system functions under the control of the government, that there are private enterprises owned and operated by citizens who have no particular role in the government. These can be the total story of industry, or it can be a split system. Some run by the government, some enterprises, some industries, others run by private entrepreneurs, private owners and operated. Scandinavia uses that concept of socialism. Germans, French, Italians, and others also do. The socialist parties in many parts of Europe advocate a socialism that's defined in that way. Traditionally, particularly after the Russian Revolution, when socialism split, a different interpretation became powerful that took also a different name, communism. And in that name, it was imperative that the government own and operate all of industry, or most at least of industry, directly as state enterprises. And you have those in the Soviet Union, you had them in the Soviet Union, you have them in the past of China, and you have them in the present of China. And by these definitions, these are socialist societies, whether it's Sweden or the People's Republic of China. But there are definitions that are different. And in those definitions, neither of these societies, that is, neither the social democracies of Europe nor the People's Republic of China, qualify for the term. And that's just a matter of the definition. Let me explain. There is a way of looking at socialism as a fundamentally different economic system in the sense of how production of goods and services is organized. You can read Marx or Lenin or any of the other great thinkers in the tradition as having a view that socialism is not about the greater or lesser role of the government. Indeed, I'll overstate the case, but to make the point clear, it's irrelevant whether the government has a larger or smaller role in regulating or taxing, or for that matter, running businesses. much more important for the socialism versus capitalism debate or discussion or differentiation is the question of the organization of production. Capitalist organizations have a split between a minority that run the enterprise, they are called employers, and the majority who work in an enterprise, who are called employees. In this definition, capitalism exists if and when and to the extent that the employer employee organization of production is in place in the economic system. The alternative would be a completely different organization that can be called a communism, which has sometimes happened, or can be called a worker cooperative. That's a more familiar name. And the basic idea there is no split between employer and employee. All the participants in every enterprise are both part of the collective employer and part of the collective of employees. And they have a kind of democratic system, one worker, one vote. All decisions are made collectively, democratically. The kinds of decisions, including what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with any profits generated or any surplus generated in the enterprise. If that is done democratically and collectively by all the participants, well, then it qualifies as having gone beyond capitalism. And by implication, clear implication, if you have not done that, if either you're private or you're public enterprises, either of them or both of them, continue to utilize the employer-employee structure, then they would not qualify under this definition under the term socialism. So if you use that last definition, then the People's Republic of China is not a socialist society. Or if you use the European social democratic definition, then it definitely is. I don't have any sense of there being any authority that tells you which of these definitions is somehow legitimate and which one isn't. I could enter the debate and talk about which ones I like more and less and where I line myself up, but I understand that there are different traditions. Socialism is a global social movement. Marxism expanded from Marx's death toward the end of the 19th century, and over the last 150 years has gone into every society in the world. These are societies at utterly different levels of economic, political, cultural development, and of course, they interpret the works of Marx or Lenin differently. And that difference is a reality that will play itself out, but there's no authority that can designate one of them as right and the other one as wrong. Insofar as you connect, as Lenin did, the desire, the need to control other countries so as to secure their markets for yourself, or to secure their raw materials or their food to feed your own working class. If what you mean by imperialism is this move to control foreign, then any society with an employer-employee division, particularly if it makes profit its bottom line, as most societies with employer-employee relationships do, well, then they will exhibit this movement to control their sources of inputs of raw materials, food and manufacturers, and so on, and likewise to control their markets. That's how capitalism has always worked. And if you see capitalism as the employer-employee relationship, well, then you would conclude that China participates in doing the same sorts of things.
Thank you. Many people would follow that train of thinking and would agree with you. There's one prominent side of the left that has a perspective I would like to get your opinion on, though. Their belief is that China's system is a mixing of both private capitalist and state capitalist formations, with a communist party in the so-called commanding heights of the economy, so to speak. And they're in an extended new economic policy directed at developing the productive forces to a point in which the level of development would allow for abundance, where we could transition or lay the base to complete the construction of socialism, or at least enter into the primary stage of socialism as it was described by Lenin. Would you agree with the statement, and could we get your opinion on it?
Sure. I think it's a perfectly reasonable inference, based on what I just said in response to your first question, to see the People's Republic of China as making a kind of new economic policy, a version, if you like, of what Lenin led the Soviet Union into in 1921 or so. I understand that letting private capitalists flourish, which they did in Russia, in Soviet Union, and they're doing obviously in the People's Republic of China, is intended by them to solve a whole raft of economic problems that hopefully will get them to a point where they can make the further transition. I commend them for understanding that what they are doing is not what socialism is, even in their definition, whatever exactly that is. In other words, that they have much more to do. I would qualify this, however, on a number of points. Number one, achieving economic growth, or whatever the word abundance is supposed to suggest. It's clear to me that that may be a necessary, but it is certainly not a sufficient condition to make the transition. That transition will be a difficult, rocky, deliberate act if it's going to happen. There would have to be the political, ideological, cultural commitment to radically transform China, in this case, to achieve such a transition. To imagine that it's somehow smoothly going to flow from economic growth is to repeat the kinds of thinking that Edward Bernstein or others indulged in at the end of the 19th century, imagining that capitalist growth somehow by itself or automatically or peacefully is going to make the transition to a socialism. I think that is unlikely and a very dangerous way to plan on what you're doing. I would also comment that there's a very famous speech Lenin gave either in 1921 or 22 before he got sick, in which he says explicitly that the Soviet Union is not yet a socialist society. And what he means, as best I can recall and remember, very important speech, is he refers to the Soviet Union at that time as a state capitalism, in which the working class, through the Communist Party, has captured the state, and so now has an unusual, extraordinary power over what remains a capitalist system, but one that the state is in command of. And then he infers from this, he draws the conclusion that the question now is when and how the working class control of the state through the Communist Party can make the next transitions that have to be made to get the Soviet Union beyond state capitalism. 8 or 9 years later, after Lenin has died, and after the struggle between Stalin and Trotsky has been resolved for Stalin, Stalin makes the extraordinary statement that we have achieved socialism, albeit in only one country. He therefore, by a stroke, declares that he's basically changing the definition from what it had been in Lenin's mind, which said that Soviet state capitalism was just that, a state capitalism, to now declaring that the power of the Communist Party being what it is, even if they have employer-employee relationships in production, it is socialism because of the power of the state. In a way, Stalin therefore moves away from Lenin's greater focus on the organization of production to a more Scandinavian social democratic notion of the power, the regulatory power of the state. And it leads to this notion that socialism has been achieved in the Soviet Union, and that has been the basis for both subsequent Soviet and much of the history of the People's Republic of China referring to their society as socialist.
Thank you very much for that lovely and in-depth answer. Of course, there could be points I can add on further, but we're tight on time, so I think we should move on to the next question. I would love to get your opinion on planning versus markets within socialist economics, particularly within socialist nation-states and their economic policy, what your opinions are on strictly planning in the form of the Gosplan that existed within the Soviet Union or similar institutions within other socialist countries. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at roughly?
Yes, I understand your question. In any case, let me answer it this way. I have been mystified all of my adult life by the fascination on the left of the differential between prices and values in Marxian economics, and equally so on the debate between the public and the private, and then equally so on this planning versus the market. I find this extraordinary. I think all three of them are diversions from what I think are the central issues that ought to be capturing people's attention. And I feel as though the enemies of socialism and Marxism have been able to define what is to be debated, and that already tilts the playing field in their favor. I would urge people to think about that. But you ask the question, let me answer. First of all, the word planning, without a lot of qualifying adjectives, leaves open an immense field, which is part of why this debate is bizarre to me. Every large multinational corporation plans everything. Indeed, it does so using many of the same tools that were developed, for example, by Gosplan in the Soviet Union and by the leading economists who developed linear programming planning models that have now been adapted by private enterprises because they understood that that's what it is they need to do. A large corporation usually gets that way by having, along the way of its growth, purchased and integrated all kinds of other companies, competitors, suppliers, buyers, vertical, horizontal integration. These multiple enterprises, as they are brought under one roof, require planning. Basically, what these corporations have done is gotten rid of the market. They don't want to have the market because it's too uncertain. They don't want to depend on the market to set the conditions under which they buy key inputs. And they don't want to rely on the market under the condition of having key buyers who buy their outputs. They want to control inputs and outputs, reducing market fluctuation and market uncertainty. And the logic of this is true not just for a corporation, but for an economy as a whole. You have more control, particularly if you are a governmental apparatus. Whether that's local or centralized government or decentralized really doesn't matter. But you can exercise more control, remove all kinds of fluctuations and risks if you substitute planning for markets, which is why all large capitalists have always done that and are doing it now. There's nothing odd or weird about socialists or communists or anybody else who wants to organize the economy as a whole to want to do the same thing. And so for me, this is a practical matter of how to achieve objectives. If you leave things to markets, you leave things to all the calculations made by people who are not focused on the global outcome. That's one of the problems of markets. That's why societies of all different kinds have tended to repress or limit or control. You can go back 5,000 years and see the debate between Plato and Aristotle about markets. Footnote, they didn't like markets. Plato wanted them gone altogether. Aristotle said we can't do it, it'll be too disruptive, so let's regulate them tightly. For them, markets were disruptive of social cohesion. That's their phrase. Exactly. That's what they are. You can do it, you can distribute goods and services through market exchange, but you will pay the price of fluctuations, interruptions that can ramify across the economy, number one. Number two, I don't like markets for all kinds of other reasons. And these are very simple. A market allocates scarce goods and services to people with the most money to pay for them. I find that extraordinary. If milk is in short supply for whatever reason, I don't want the people with the most money to be able to buy the milk to feed their pets. I'd rather have the milk go to feed the children. If the children's parents don't have the money, that's an interesting factoid, but I don't care because I have a different standard for what should happen when goods and services are scarce. And let me close this point by dramatizing to people. During World War II, when a huge portion of the resources of the United States were diverted from civilian goods to produce military goods for the war effort, the remaining resources usable for consumer goods meant that the quantity of consumer goods would be drastically curtailed. Had the distribution of those consumer goods that were still being produced been left to the market, only rich people would have been able to get the consumer goods. They would have bid up their prices until everybody else could not afford them anymore. That's how the scarcity would have been happened. It was determined by the government of the United States, Republicans and Democrats, who were 100% pro-capitalist, to dispense with the market. We set up a system in the United States called rationing. In order to buy a gallon of gas or a quart of milk or a pound of sugar or ounces of meat or many other commodities, coffee and cooking oil and all kinds of other things, you needed a ration card. If you didn't have the ration card, the storekeeper could not sell you the product. And he would go to jail if he sold it to somebody who didn't have a ration card. And how did you get a ration card? The government distributed. And how did the government distribute it? According to, get ready, people's needs. If you had a large family, you got a lot of ration tickets for milk. If you didn't have any kids, you didn't, and so on and so forth. So abolishing the market for a planned distribution using umpteen different possible systems is a triviality. Doesn't have much to do with the capitalism, socialism debate, and shouldn't have been allowed to become a focus of debate because it takes that debate away from much more crucial issues like whether you have an employer-employee dichotomy organizing your factories, offices, and stores, or whether you have a democratically run collective of the workers doing that.
Thank you very much for that lovely answer. I think we only have time for one more question, and that is this. Both myself and those that watch my channel are well aware of your work, your channel, and your views, particularly on cooperatives and the rearrangement of the organization of enterprises. So my question is, what is your view of cooperatives going into socialism? Like in a capitalist system, let's say, for example, in the current United States or whatever other country, say Bangladesh, for example, if there was to be a buildup of cooperative enterprises or reorganization via buyouts, like workers buying out their enterprises and reorganizing, if that were to happen, how would the next stage or transition to socialism occur? My question somewhat falls into the reform versus revolution question. How would the conquering of state power, if it were to take place at all, how would that play into simply reorganizing the enterprise? Is that enough for us to reach socialism, or is there another step required after this buildup of cooperatives?
If you're asking how it's going to work in the future, the only honest answer I could give you is I don't know. Nobody
Mm,
does.
mm,
But what I can do, and what I think you're asking me to do, is to give you a sense of how I imagine or see such a transition coming.
mm,
So let me do that, and hopefully that responds to your question.
mm,
I would expect that the evolution and development of worker co-ops produces in the economic system something comparable to what Lenin and Trotsky and the others called dual power.
mm,
In other words, you're going to create an alternative economic structure. Worker co ops are going to be a part, if they develop, of a society in which capitalistically organized enterprises, that is hierarchical, with a tiny minority at the top, the owner of the business, the board of directors if it's corporate, and so on, make all the key decisions: what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits, versus a worker co op where those same decisions are made by everyone. No one is excluded. One person, one vote, majority rules, democracy. These two enterprises are now going to be coexisting. And that means that every government program in such a society is, whether you intend it or not, going to become contested. That is, the capitalistically organized enterprises want the government to sustain and support them, as it has in every capitalist country for at least the history of the capitalism in each country. The worker co-ops are going to have an alternative set of demands that they put on the state. If subsidies are to be given out, they want some. If
mm,
the tax law is to be changed, they have ideas on how to do that. If capital is scarce for worker co-ops to get going or to enlarge, they want the state to address that. The capitalist enterprises are going to push in alternative and often contested ways. Well, the
mm,
capitalists have something already that the co ops don't have. The capitalists have political parties. In the United States, for example, they have the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, who are each outdoing the other to be supportive and celebratory towards capitalism.
mm,
Worker co ops, by contrast, have no political party. So the next step, to answer your question, is for the worker co-ops to understand that they have to do what the capitalists learned they had to do as they emerged out of feudalism. They had to develop political parties that were advocates at the level of the state. Whether the state was a king or the state was a parliament, it really doesn't matter. Their political parties, starting small, had to grow to become powerful enough to shape governmental policy to enhance the capitalist enterprises whose growing wealth would allow more resources to shape the politics in a back and forth that
mm,
explains the last 200 years of capitalism. I would expect something comparable to happen, that the co-op worker co-ops understand, both for their advance but also for their protection of what they already have, they need political representation and they need political parties, and they will form them. And
mm,
just like in capitalism, the worker co-ops will be the economic base of such a political party. It will raise money, it will
mm,
recruit, it will spread the word, and the parties, in turn, will put into place elected officials and others who will get the legislation that enhances the growth and power of the co ops.
mm,
Could there then come a time when frictions develop, hostilities develop, and we then have a conflict between the capitalist sector and its parties on the one hand, and the
mm,
co op sector and its parties on the other, and that becomes akin to a civil war? Absolutely, that's one way that this may get fought out. In
Mm,
some parts of Europe, the capitalist parties basically were able to eventually take state power with not too much in the way of civil military strife. In
mm,
others, they couldn't. They had to go to a military solution. The French Revolution is the obvious example. But the English Revolution, a century or so earlier, and even the American Revolution, the decision was made in the United States and it was debated. Do we want to become independent and set up our own monarchy? No. The
mm,
decision was made, not only do we become independent from the British monarch of the time, George III, but we're not going to set up our own monarchy. We don't want a monarchy. They
mm.
made the break from the feudal, the residue, if you like, of
Yeah.
monarchy. And I think worker co-ops will be in comparable struggles about the political shape of their growth within a capitalist system
Mm,
that is, in my judgment, already having fundamental problems that it cannot solve.
mm. Thank you so much for that absolutely phenomenal answer. If you would indulge us, just to piggyback off that question, in your book Contending Economic Theories, where you take a look at neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian concepts, there's a passage in which you consider the Yugoslav experience of cooperatives and cooperative buildup. You speak of it positively. My question about this is, what would be the criticisms of the Yugoslav implementation, and would it align, or are you familiar with the criticisms of that type of system made by, for example, Yakovenko and Cockshott in critiquing what they would have considered market socialism with the cooperative presence? Simply, my question, very condensed, is what is your criticism of the Yugoslav implementation from the economic perspective, less so the political overbearingness?
Okay,
Mm,
there are a number of ways to do this, although how you could separate it from the political in the case of Yugoslavia strikes me as difficult, and I'm not sure why you would really
mm,
want to do that. What I like about Yugoslavia was, let me be blunt, they were daring. They
mm,
wanted to take the socialism that they had inherited, European socialism, and take it right down into the workplace.
mm,
Since that's something that matters a great deal to me, it's how I understand, interpret, and teach
mm,
Marxian economics and have all my life. I take my hat off to this effort to bring the revolution right down into the enterprise, to trust the mass of people, to
mm,
imagine that they can be more than the drones of labor that capitalism has always made the majority of people. The folks who come 9 to 5, 5 days a week or more, whatever the
mm,
case may be, do what they're told, how they're told, where they are told, and at the end of each day go home having lost all connection. Marxism likes the phrase alienation with the
mm,
fruits of their labor, of what they have poured their brains and muscles into all day long. This is a horrific psychological and social catastrophe, and that they were willing in Yugoslavia more than the Russians or other Eastern Europeans, with some exceptions. Collective farms in Czechoslovakia and so on
mm,
are important exceptions. But with those exceptions, they were willing to try to
mm,
set up genuine worker run, worker owned enterprises. The problem is when you have that move, you then have to adjust all of the other institutions of a modern economy so that they do not undermine, run counter to, obstruct what you're trying to do inside the enterprise. Look, it's a truism in the history of markets that markets are different depending on the class structures they mediate. How
mm,
does the market affect, for example, slavery had markets. Every American city in the American South has a monument somewhere to the slave markets that existed
mm,
in Charlotte, in Atlanta, in you name it, wherever it was. Markets in slavery are different from what the markets were in European feudalism. And each of them is different from what the markets were in slavery. Markets are powerful, socially influential institutions. What
Mm,
you have to do is you have to change the way markets work in a society like Yugoslavia was trying to create so that they reinforce and do not undermine and disrupt what you're trying to do inside the enterprise. That had to be learned by each social system that tried to use markets. And by regulating markets, I also mean suspending them,
mm,
not using markets when it isn't the best way to go.
mm,
When the very social structure you're developing in an enterprise is better served by abolishing the markets here. That's why I gave you the example of the rationing in World War II. It
mm,
was better to win that war and reinforce American capitalism. It was better to abolish the market in a whole raft of consumer goods than to keep it going. It's a
mm,
mechanical way of thinking to think that these institutions all have to line up at the same time in the same way. They don't. You need to understand what is your priority and
mm,
then adjust the institutions. To make a long story short, I don't think the folks in Yugoslavia figured that out, understood
mm,
that, and took the steps that were necessary. And I don't
mm,
mean to be a Monday morning quarterback. I doubt that anybody could have done much better than what they did. But
mm,
they also then had the problem, which is crucial, and I need to say it. If you understand what we're saying, those of us that advocate the abolition of the employer
mm,
employee relationship, or to use the same language to say the same thing, if you really understand what it means to abolish the class structure of the capitalist enterprise,
mm,
well, then it follows that the political system, like the market, has to be adjusted to that reality.
mm,
You now have to understand that the state is no longer dependent upon and interactive with the people of a capitalist system, namely the people who run the enterprise.
mm,
It is now directly connected to the mass of people since they're the ones who run each enterprise in the workplaces that they are engaged in. You have to give them their space. You
mm,
have to give them their right to make mistakes, to make judgments that may or may not be consistent with your economic plans.
mm,
This is a very complicated, delicate kind of adjustment. It's comparable to the adjustments capitalist governments had to make in the transition from feudalism, or feudal governments in the transition from slavery. And those were difficult transitions. But this one is difficult too. And I don't think, however great a wartime leader he was, Tito, the leader in Yugoslavia at the
mm,
time of these experiments, I don't think there was a developed understanding of what trusting the people, which is what you have to do here, what that
mm,
really means. And I don't think they thought it was possible. And look, they may have been right. It may not have been at the
mm,
time. But then if you make that judgment, then your options and what you could have done, including internally to the worker co-ops, would have been very different from what they seemed to have imagined they
mm,
could do. And when they
mm,
failed, of course, then they failed catastrophically.
mm. Absolutely fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
I am very grateful that you found the time to come and talk to me today and to impart your knowledge on me and everybody else who will enjoy watching this video. Um, if you could, possibly on these topics that we discussed today, for example, China, markets, planning, Yugoslavia, if you can think of any book recommendations that you may give that can further expand this discussion, please feel free to say so. Otherwise, we can just continue to the end.
Sure. I have written 3 books over the last 3 years
Mm,
that were mainly written in order to answer the flood of questions that come into us because I do a lot of public speaking. So if these comments I've made are interesting, let me simply mention them because
Mm.
they will contain elaborated versions of what you just heard me say.
Mm.
The first one, published about 2.5 years ago, was called Understanding Marxism. The second one, published a year later, was called Understanding Socialism.
Mm.
And the third one was just published a few months ago, is called The Sickness is the System When Capitalisms Fail to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself.
Mm.
All three of those books are available at our website, which is democracyatwork.info. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. So anyone interested, that would be the best way to get a more elaborated presentations of these points.
Mm. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. This has been a very eye-opening talk, and I hope that everybody has learned a lot from having the pleasure of listening to you speak. As for me personally, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. On a personal note, I've been watching your videos, and I've read almost every work you've published. I have not read your bachelor's thesis yet on colonization in Kenya, but just about everything else.
Okay.
So
Well,
thank you very much.
that's very kind of you. Thank you. I enjoy talking about these topics. I've been studying and teaching this material for a long time and am very engaged with it. So this is an opportunity for me to refresh my thinking, to think again, and that's as it should be. So I'm grateful to you as well.
All right. Well, this will be all for today. Again, thank you again for coming and joining us and using your very valuable time, I'm aware, to talk to me tonight. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
take care.
You too. Bye bye.